An Oriental gentleman on a transatlantic liner is sitting in a deck chair near a Westerner. They introduce themselves as Mr. Goldberg and Mr. Chen. Without warning, suddenly Mr. Goldberg leans across and slaps Mr. Chen on the cheek. "Why did you do that?" demands the astonished victim of the assault. "Because of what you did at Pearl Harbor." "But I'm Chinese, not Japanese." "Chinese, Japanese, you look the same to me." Then, just as suddenly, Mr. Chen slaps Mr. Goldberg. "What's that for?" "My great-grandfather went down on the Titanic. You sank it," is the reply. "But the Titanic hit an iceberg." "Iceberg, Goldberg, sounds the same to me." Shakespeare had another way of putting it. "What's in a name?" Juliet tells Romeo. "That which we call a rose, by any other name, would smell as sweet." Ehud Olmert has had a busy week. Having previously done well in Washington and then in Egypt and Jordan, the Israeli Prime Minister has been trying to convey in London and Paris the merits of his so-called convergence or realignment plan in the West Bank. That is, a second planned significant Israeli withdrawal from the Palestinian territories, following last year's pullout from Gaza, and removal of many of the outlying settlements, as Israel seeks to refix its borders roughly along the lines of the security fence wall which it is busy completing. But having run into difficulties in selling the unilateral realignment plan, even to good friends both in Washington and in Europe, Olmert is evidently upping the importance of the first phase of the planned unilateral pullback negotiations with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. More significantly, Olmert is also reportedly reshaping the way the projected realignment plan is conveyed as a way of stabilizing the conflict with the Palestinians. The alternative ideas which we learn are being mooted in the highest government circles aim at transforming the realignment plan from a unilateral move into a bilateral move, carried out in conjunction with the Palestinian Authority, at least to try to achieve that. The end result, however, like the smell of the rose, would be the same. According to these reliable estimates and accounts, Israel would propose to President Abbas that agreement be reached whereby Israeli withdrawal leads to the creation of a Palestinian state with provisional boundaries, an entity that covers the full Gaza Strip, from which Israel has already withdrawn, and also some 90% of the West Bank. The provisional border thus created in the West Bank would roughly match the route of the security barrier or separation fence. Although Israel would still retain security control in the Jordan Valley, the plan would effectively end the 4 decades of Israeli occupation of large parts of the West Bank, and would result in the Palestinians having the boundaries of their provisional state drawn in this unilaterally conceived but now jointly implemented plan. At the same time, however, it would still mean that Israel would be redrawing its own borders, something which until now has been the only issue highlighted in the Olmert realignment plan. And the fixing of the new border in this way would also leave open the option for future peace moves to hammer out eventually final borders which are acceptable to both sides. These interesting new diplomatic maneuvers and variations on the planned realignment in the West Bank come against the backdrop of a further slide into bloody hostilities across the Israel-Gaza border. As dozens of rockets rain down on towns in the Negev desert, Israel has pulled no punches in trying to curb the rocketing. This has resulted in many civilian deaths on the Palestinian side and left an angry dispute raging about who bears responsibility for that, Israel or the Palestinian militants who seek to keep up that confrontation, even though the Israeli occupation of Gaza ended nearly a year ago. Israel repeatedly expresses its regrets over non-combatants being killed or wounded during its military actions against the militants. Rightly so. That, however, makes little impression on Palestinian anger, which is translating into demands for international inquiries and intervention. But surely amidst this ongoing, very angry confrontation, there's one very pertinent fact which seems largely to be pushed into the background. In the past, such instances of Palestinian loss of life, such expressions of Israeli regret, went unnoticed amidst Palestinian rage and international condemnation. That, however, was when Israel was in occupation of Gaza. Now what is happening is a bloody cross-border confrontation. Tragic as the many Palestinian deaths have been, it's not the sound of the same situation at all. It's a very different battle, war you might even say, being fought without Israel still being in occupation of Gaza. Two questions hang fatefully now in the air. First, whether or not Hamas chooses to break a year-long ceasefire, and second, whether or not these incidents prod the Palestinians to resolve their internal differences about how to proceed in face of Israel's declared intention to go on acting unilaterally, should the Palestinians not be prepared seriously to negotiate the future together with Israel. For its part, the overall thrust of Israeli policy remains headed in the same direction, towards separating Israelis from Palestinians more and more from one another, and Palestinians from Israelis. That is, further eroding the occupation with a view to having the two sides eventually arrayed on separate sides of a newly delineated border, whether in non-violent coexistence or in confrontation. Simon MacDonald is the British ambassador in Israel. He was party to the talks in London this week between Prime Ministers Olmert and Blair, at the end of which Ambassador MacDonald said cogently, there must be a first major attempt at negotiating a full-scale agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. If, however, that fails, we must definitely engage a path-blazing initiative to prevent the situation becoming frozen in permanent bloody confrontation. The Israeli Prime Minister appears then to have won, like he had earlier done in Washington, conditional support for the realignment plan. Whether, however, this eventually results in unilateral Israeli action, or in a coordinated Israeli-Palestinian move, or in a unilaterally imposed Palestinian entity, could depend very much on the outcome of the internal Palestinian power struggle between Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, which is playing out right now, both in Gaza and in the West Bank.